Hello, my name's Julia Worsley. Welcome to True Crime Stories, brought to you by Portsmouth News. Victor Farrant was Britain's most notorious fugitive, following the brutal murder of accountant Glenda Hoskins at her Port Solent home on February the 7th, 1996. The Portsmouth labourer drowned the 45-year-old mother of three, who was his ex-girlfriend, underwater in the bath after demanding sex. Farrant claimed she simply slipped in the bath and banged her head. He then hid her body in the attic before fleeing the scene. After the murder, he took off in Mrs. Hoskins' car before driving along the south coast whilst stopping off to sell items he had stolen from her house. The killer then fled to Europe, where he stayed in Brussels whilst moving around frequently. Prior to the killing, Farrant was jailed for 12 years in 1988 for raping a woman and causing her grievous bodily harm, as well as attacking another female with a bread knife. He met Mrs. Hoskins on day release from prison in 1993, before his release from behind bars in 1995. Just a month after his release on December the 27th, 1995, he went to visit sex worker Anne Fiddler in Eastleigh, before attacking her with bottles and an iron. The attack was so ferocious, she was left with partial brain damage and no memory of the incident. She needed a blood transfusion and was in a coma for over 2 weeks, with doctors saying that she was lucky to be alive. Farrant, known as a charmer, then picked up his relationship with Mrs. Hoskins, who was separated from her husband. But the relationship didn't last, and she'd started to see other men. Farrant was possessive and started stalking her before murdering her.
My name's Steve Reed. I'm a photographer. I run Blitz Photography in Gosport. At the time of the Victor Farrant trial, I was a senior photographer at the Portsmouth News. I was a senior photographer at the Portsmouth News for 22 years. When the news broke, the police already had a suspect in mind. They knew that Victor Farrant was a person of interest and he had disappeared. So we got quite a lot of information out of the paper almost immediately, giving a bit of background to who he was, where he'd lived, because the police were looking for any leads that they possibly could get to find out where Farrant was. And they used the paper to put out as many appeals as possible to keep the story alive. One of the first things we did when the police gave us all the information about Farrant was to go to the locations and try and interview people and find out a bit about him. And one of the first things that I did was I went with a reporter to Portsmouth Grammar School, where we had been told that he had been a handyman, an old job man, and we were going to try and see if anybody knew him, remembered him, and get some information that way. But when we got to the school, they didn't really want to comment, so the door was sort of shut in our faces almost immediately, and me and the reporter were wondering what to do, and we wandered across the road into, there used to be a tuck shop in the high street opposite the school where the kids used to go and get their sweets. Anyway, well, we wandered in there, and I think the reporter wanted to get something to eat. And I'm stood there with my camera bag, and she's got a notebook, and the woman behind the counter said to us, "What are you doing here?" And we said, "Oh, we're just following up on the Victor Farrant case, because he used to work at the school." And she just looked at us and said, "I wondered when you'd find me." It turned out that her name was Karen Mitchell, and she was a friend of Glenda Hoskins, and she'd known Victor Farrant. They used to go out in the evenings to the nightclubs in Portsmouth, and Victor Farrant had come into contact with Glenda Hoskins at one of those nightclubs. So we spoke to her, and she was very, very concerned about Victor Farrant, because clearly he was at large. Nobody knew where he was at this point. Nobody knew that he'd left the country. And I think she feared for her life. I think she was genuinely scared that he might come back and attack her too.
Posters and information were sent to all police forces throughout Europe as Hampshire Police launched one of its biggest ever manhunts to find Farrant, who had fled Britain. No positive sightings were made of Farrant since he had last been seen in Portsmouth and Brighton on February the 7th. He gave Belgian authorities the slip in Brussels after taking a friend's car. Police appealed through the news for Farrant to give himself up.
Karen Mitchell told us that Victor Farrant was a very, very charming man. She said that Glenda had kind of was fallen for him quite quickly, and she had no idea, how dangerous he was. At the News, we used to have a dedicated crime correspondent, dedicated court correspondent. So we had a correspondent who was well connected within, had lots of contacts within the police and was able to get the information that we needed to tell the story. Again, because you've got an active investigation on, the police aren't going to tell you everything, and they generally will hold stuff back because they don't want to prejudice the case in the long run. But I think everyone involved in gathering news understands that the police have a job to do, and we were basically just using all the information that they were giving us because we knew that it was helping them to keep the story alive, keep eyes on Victor Farrant, and if the story stayed alive, then sooner or later Victor Farrant would show up.
Farrant was finally found after a British tourist recognised him. On returning to the UK, the tourist notified police that Farrant was working at a hostel in Nice, France. On July the 5th, 1996, an international arrest warrant was issued, and Farrant was arrested in the south of France by French police and detained.
Yeah, I think that when news broke that Victor Farrant had been apprehended in Nice, I think there was a great, sigh of relief, because there were a lot of people who were concerned that he'd come back and attack them. I think Karen Mitchell was one of those women who she'd been quite brave to tell us her story, because I think she was genuinely fearful of a reprisal from Victor Farrant. So when he was apprehended in police, I think there was a great sigh of relief from everybody, because we knew that this very, very dangerous man was now in police custody.
In January 1998, at Winchester Crown Court, Farrant pleaded not guilty to murdering Mrs. Hoskins and not guilty to the attempted murder of Mrs. Fiddler.
One of the things as a newspaper photographer you can do is you can actually go into the courtroom. At Winchester, the dock is directly underneath the level of the public gallery. So if you sit in the public gallery, you can't see the accused. So as in most courts, you can go into the court and identify the character and watch the proceedings from inside the courtroom. And I sat in on a few of the days and watched the proceedings, and I was there when the prosecutors were asking Farrant about the attack on Anne Fiddler, and it was amazing to watch him squirm and try and wriggle out of all the accusations. He seemed to have an answer for everything. There was a lot of forensic evidence that was presented to him. His DNA was there, his boot print was there, his handprint was there, and every time he was asked how it got there, he had an answer. And he was very, very evasive, and you could just see, I think everyone in the courtroom could see that he was lying to try and save his own skin.
On January 29th, 1998, Judge Mr. Justice Butterfield said the murder of Mrs. Hoskins was a ruthless, callous and evil act. The judge said the murder of Mrs. Hoskins was a crime that was planned, premeditated and committed in cold blood, with Farrant not prepared to tolerate rejection. Farrant was jailed for life for Evelyn Hoskins' murder and given a further 18 years for the attempted murder of Anne Fiddler.
It's strange, even after all this time. I find it really emotional to remember those children. Watching Farrant. I can remember Katie's face
looking straight at him as he was sentenced. It was so powerful. They were so brave, those kids were so brave. But yeah, at the sentencing, because the children couldn't see Farrant in the dock because he was below them, below the public gallery, the judge allowed the children to come into the courtroom and face him as he was sentenced. So when the judge sentenced him to life, and life meaning life, the children were able to look him in the eye and know that he was going away for life for killing their mother.
The children of Mrs. Hoskins spoke for the first time about the night of the killing and its effect on their family in the weeks following the sentence. They revealed how detectives had to separate Katie and David Hoskins and their father Tony within hours of the discovery of Mrs. Hoskins' body. They were taken to individual rooms at a police station and interviewed. They told the news, "We never thought he was that evil. We knew he was being possessive and would not take no for an answer. I thought he may have been round and then gone off and killed himself or something, but we never thought he was a psychopath."